The rain hadn't touched the cracked earth of Dunridge County in weeks, and dust clung to everything like an old curse. The air shimmered with heat as people shuffled into the auction yard, boots thudding against wooden planks worn smooth by decades of deals made, horses lost, and lives changed. Most came out of habit, some out of need. A few came just to watch something wild break. Among the usual crowd of ranchers and traders, an old woman stepped onto the gravel with a cane tapping the rhythm of a stubborn heart. Her name was Mabel Thatcher, but no one here remembered it. Time had folded her into the background, stooped, gray-haired, dressed in a sun-faded blouse and skirt too heavy for the weather. She walked with the determination of someone who had lost nearly everything and didn't have much left to lose. She made her way toward the corral, past a group of men who paused to chuckle as she passed. Not cruelly, but dismissively, like watching a tumbleweed roll across the lot. Interesting for a second, then gone. Inside the rusting pens, the horses stirred uneasily. Most were calm enough. Some pawed the ground, some shook flies from their manes, but one, the last in the line, was different. The black Mustang stood as if carved from iron, wild-eyed, foam at the corners of his mouth. He jerked his head violently every time someone approached. Rope burns cut deep into his neck from being dragged in. No halter stayed on him long. They called him Reaper. A cruel name, maybe, but it had stuck after he'd sent 3 handlers to the hospital over the last week. He was branded as Untamable, wild stock that had no place among men. Mabel watched him from behind the bars, her sharp gray eyes narrowing as the horse threw his body against the side of the enclosure. The gate shuddered but held. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her cane pressing deep into the gravel. Her gaze held steady, searching past the fury and into something buried beneath it. A young stable hand noticed her and wandered over, nervous energy in every step. "Ma'am, I wouldn't stand too close. That one's dangerous." Mabel didn't look away. They all are until they ain't. He blinked. Well, this one's been through 4 buyers already. Each one brought him back the next day, or sent him back from the hospital. "Still breathing, though," she said softly. The boy scratched his head, then shrugged and left her alone. The auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp and fast, snapping attention to the center ring. The crowd shifted toward the bleachers. Mabel took her seat quietly near the back, ignoring the curious glances tossed her way. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her cane, but her eyes never left the gate. The auction rolled on like an old engine, smooth, practiced, impersonal. Horses were let in, circled once or twice, sold to the highest bidder. Some buyers smiled, others sighed. Mabel watched them all, but her gaze kept drifting to the gate where Reaper waited. Time ticked on. Her heart beat heavier with each passing lot. Then the murmur started. The crowd sat straighter. Someone whispered, "Here he comes." The gate opened with a reluctant creak, and Reaper exploded into the ring. He didn't walk in. He fought his way in, dragging 2 handlers behind him before shaking them off with a savage twist of his neck. The auctioneer backed up instinctively, microphone trembling. The horse reared, his hooves slamming into the ground with thunderous force. The crowd gasped as one of the handlers stumbled back, narrowly avoiding a blow. "Lot 47, the auctioneer called out, voice shaking but professional. 6-year-old Mustang, unbroken. Proven bloodline. Strong build, but not recommended for amateurs." No one moved. A silence settled over the yard like a dust storm. Bidders looked to one another, unsure. Whispers started, about injuries, lawsuits, a horse possessed. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Opening bid, $500. Nothing. Do I hear 500? Still nothing. Reaper tossed his head, snorted, and turned in a full circle, as if daring the crowd to step forward. His muscles rippled beneath his coat like coils of rope, his breath steaming in the air. A woman near the front clutched her purse tighter. 400. A child began to cry. The mother shushed him quickly, eyes locked on the Mustang. 3. Then, just as the auctioneer raised his voice to drop it again, a small voice came from the back. 200. Heads turned. Mabel didn't stand. She simply lifted a trembling hand. The auctioneer hesitated. 200 from the back. Do I hear 250? No answer. Sold. To the lady in the back. It was too late to take it back, even if she'd wanted to. Reaper reared again, this time slamming his front hooves down hard enough to rattle the fencing. The crowd buzzed, confused and intrigued. Who was the old woman who'd just bought a living storm? Mabel stood slowly, her knees complaining beneath her. Her eyes never left Reaper's. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She just walked toward the pen with the careful steadiness of someone approaching not a beast, but a truth. The handlers stepped aside warily. She moved close enough to feel the heat of him, the sweat and fear rolling off his flanks. He snorted hard, pawing the ground. Any sudden move would have ended it right there. But she made none. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small square of cloth, faded, once red, now the color of dried blood. She held it out slowly. Reaper stopped. For the first time since entering the ring, he froze. His ears flicked forward. His chest heaved. Mabel whispered something no one else could hear. A hush fell again over the yard, deeper this time. A kind of reverent stillness. Then Reaper, untamable, wild, vengeful Reaper, took one step forward. The silence broke in gasps. One of the handlers swore under his breath. A man from the crowd muttered, "That's not possible." But Mabel didn't speak. She simply turned and started walking toward the open gate. And Reaper, after a pause thick with disbelief, followed her. One step, then two. The storm had moved, and it was following an old woman with a cane. Reaper didn't walk so much as stalk behind her, each step heavy with suspicion. His hooves clanked against the trailer's ramp as if testing the strength of the metal. Mabel didn't rush him. She didn't coax or command. She simply stood there beside the open gate with her cane dug into the dirt, the red cloth now tied loosely around her wrist. When the Mustang finally stepped inside, the world seemed to exhale. The handlers stayed far back, watching in stunned silence as she closed the trailer's gate without flinching. A few murmurs drifted from the crowd, part disbelief, part morbid curiosity. One man chuckled dryly and muttered, "She's not making it through the night." Mabel ignored them all. She climbed into the battered pickup that had sat parked in the same spot for 2 decades and started the engine with a sputtering growl. The trailer rattled behind her as she drove down the dirt path, heading toward the edge of town and then farther, into the hills where no street lights reached. Dust kicked up in clouds behind her, trailing off into the fading gold of evening. Her home was nothing more than a wooden frame hunched beside a patch of thirsty land. A small corral of splintered fence posts and rusted wire stretched behind the house. A few tools leaned against the side, long untouched. Nothing moved but the wind. No one waited inside. She parked, stepped out, and walked to the trailer without hesitation. When she opened it, Reaper stood still in the dim light, nostrils flaring. He looked at her the way a soldier might look at an old battlefield, tense, wary, already remembering past scars. She didn't try to touch him. Instead, she backed away slowly, leading him into the corral. He hesitated, then followed. Inside the fencing, he paced like a caged fire, muscles tense, every sense alert. Mabel stood at the edge and watched, silent, her hands folded over the cane. The red cloth fluttered in the wind, catching the horse's eye now and then. She saw it, the flicker of recognition. Not understanding, not trust, but memory. It was enough. That night, the wind moaned through the cracks in the old wooden walls. Mabel sat by the window, eyes trained on the dark shape moving restlessly in the corral. She hadn't lit the lamps. She didn't need to see. She only needed to listen, to the hooves scraping, the occasional snort, the silence between the storms of motion. She didn't sleep. By dawn, the wind had stilled, and so had the Mustang. She stepped outside, cane tapping against the porch, and made her way slowly to the gate. Reaper stood still as stone, watching her. His ears were forward, not back. She saw the difference. "I ain't here to break you," she said, her voice low and rasped by time. "Just figured maybe we both got some years left, and I didn't want to spend mine alone." She tossed a flake of hay into the pen. He didn't approach, but he didn't shy away either. It went on like that for days. No rope, no saddle, just her, a chair by the fence, And the stories she spoke aloud. Not for the horse, not really. For the ghost she carried. They said he couldn't be saved, too, she murmured one morning as Reaper grazed a few feet away. Tommy. My boy. The name settled into the air like dust, light but impossible to ignore. War'll take things from you. Sometimes quick, sometimes slow. Sometimes you don't know what it took, till years later. She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. He came back, but not all the way. And I didn't know how to help. Her eyes glistened. She blinked it away. He had that same look you've got now. Always ready to fight, but not 'cause he wanted to. 'Cause he didn't think there was anything else left. Reaper stopped grazing. He turned slightly, not all the way to face her, but it was enough. She smiled then, not big, not proud. Just enough to survive the day. That afternoon, a truck came up the drive. It was rusted at the wheel wells and rumbled like a tired dog. Mabel looked up as a tall, broad-shouldered man climbed out. His boots hit the dirt hard. His face was sunburned and drawn, but his eyes softened when they found hers. Miss Thatcher, he said, tipping his hat. Name's Elias Keene. Animal Control sent me. Don't need control, Mabel replied flatly. Need understanding. He nodded, amused. Heard you bought the devil himself. Her gaze sharpened. Then they've been talking too much. Elias walked with her to the corral, his eyes never leaving Reaper. He nearly killed a trainer in Boise, trampled another in Santa Fe. We've been chasing this horse across 3 states. You know what they were going to do with him. Mabel's silence was answer enough. I just came to make sure you weren't bleeding out behind the barn. She raised an eyebrow. I appreciate your concern, but I've seen worse than a wild horse. Reaper came to the fence just then, as if summoned by her voice. He didn't snort, didn't rear. He simply stared at Elias, with a slow blink that made the man shift uncomfortably. I'll be damned, Elias muttered. Mabel turned to him. He's not broken, just misplaced. The younger man studied her, unsure whether to admire or fear her resolve. Finally, he gave a slow nod. You need anything, you call me. I ain't far. She nodded, and he left without pressing further. That night, Reaper let her stand within 5 feet of him. She didn't reach out, didn't speak. She just stood there as the wind picked up again, and the stars emerged one by one over the hills. They were 2 remnants of different storms, circling each other in a quiet ceasefire. By the end of the week, he followed her from one end of the corral to the other, slow and watchful. She talked of small things, sunsets, lost time, the way grief feels like a second skin. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. He was listening, and that was more than she'd gotten in years. She knew what they said, that she was crazy, that the horse would snap, but what they didn't see, what they didn't understand, was that sometimes it took something wild to reach something broken, and both of them had been broken for far too long. You said. By the 2nd month, Reaper no longer flinched when Mabel entered the corral. He still didn't let her touch him, not fully, but he no longer bolted when her shadow stretched across his back. Every morning, she would lean against the fence and speak to him in that low, even tone of hers, part conversation, part confession. The cane was used less now, not because her body had healed, but because her will was stronger than her bones. One morning, while the sky still held the chill of dawn, she opened the gate and stepped inside with the halter dangling loosely in her hand. Reaper raised his head. He didn't back away. I won't make you wear it, she said, but I'd like you to see it. That's all. She crouched down slowly, each movement deliberate, and set the halter on the ground between them. Then she retreated. The Mustang took a step forward, sniffed. Another step. His hoof nudged the leather. Mabel watched, not with triumph, but with quiet hope, the kind only time and patience could earn. By noon, the halter still lay in the dirt, untouched again. But Mabel smiled anyway. Close enough for today, she murmured. The visits from Elias grew more frequent, though he never came uninvited. He brought hay bales, water troughs, a roll of fencing when a post had collapsed during a storm. Always useful things, never pity. They sat on the porch sometimes, sipping bitter coffee from mismatched mugs, watching Reaper pace the fence line. "He's changed," Elias said one evening. "No," Mabel corrected. "He's remembering who he was before the world told him to fight." Elias looked at her with something like awe. "Most folks would have given up." "Most folks never lost the right things," she answered. He said nothing after that, but he stayed a little longer than usual. The town noticed. People who had once muttered about the crazy widow and her demon horse now lingered at the edge of her land, peering through the trees. Whispers made their way to the feed store, the church, even the sheriff's office. The story twisted with each telling. Some said she bewitched the animal, others that the horse was her dead husband come back in spirit. Mabel didn't care what they said. She wasn't doing it for them. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence, Mabel heard the unmistakable sound of hooves on the porch. She turned slowly. Reaper stood at the bottom of the steps, head tilted, ears flicking. For the first time, he had approached without prompting, as if checking on her. "Well now," she said softly, dropping the hammer to her side. "Took you long enough." He didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. She sat on the porch steps and let the moment breathe. From that day on, he followed her like a shadow, still skittish, still cautious, but tethered by something invisible and real. When she limped to the barn to fetch feed, he trailed behind. When she paused to sit beneath the cottonwood tree near the back pasture, he circled once, then stood guard at a distance. One morning, after a restless night of thunderstorms, Mabel opened the barn to find him already inside, waiting. Not trapped. Waiting. The halter hung from a hook nearby. She took it down, walked slowly, stopped 3 feet from him. "This is the last step," she whispered. "You trust me now." Reaper lowered his head. She reached out. The leather slid over his nose, without resistance. She fastened the buckle with trembling fingers, then stepped back. He didn't bolt. She wept, not loud, not broken, but in a quiet, shaking way that sounded like gratitude. Elias came by that evening. When she showed him what Reaper had allowed, his eyes widened. "You're gonna ride him?" "Not yet," she said. "Maybe not ever. Some things don't need saddles to be real." But the thought lingered. Weeks passed, and the bond solidified. Reaper allowed touch, then grooming, then finally the pressure of a saddle blanket across his back. It wasn't smooth. There were setbacks. One day, he reared and kicked a bucket clean across the yard. Another, he bit at her sleeve in a panic. But each time, she didn't punish. She waited, reassured, showed up again the next day. The first time she mounted him, she didn't ride. She just sat in the saddle while he stood still, breathing hard. Her hands were steady, her legs weak. But in that stillness, something passed between them, an unspoken pact. Not of dominance, but of trust. A week later, she rode him to the cottonwood tree. It was a slow, shaky ride. Her body ached. Her breath came shallow. But Reaper moved like he'd always been waiting to carry someone who wouldn't demand too much. Neighbors began to stop by more often. Not gawking now, curious, inspired. A woman from the vet clinic brought apples. A boy from the next ranch offered to mend fences. They didn't speak much. They just came and helped. The mayor sent word. "We'd like to recognize your work at the county fair. A special exhibition." Mabel almost laughed. "He's not a show pony," she said. Elias encouraged her. "It's not about showing him off. It's about showing what patience can do." The day of the fair came with warm winds and bright banners. Mabel wore her old boots, the ones with worn soles and creased leather. Reaper stood tall beside her, coat glossy, eyes clear. He walked into the arena, without resistance, without a rope, just her and the red cloth tied around her wrist like always. The crowd was silent at first. Then, as Reaper circled her in a calm arc, they erupted into applause. But Mabel didn't hear the clapping. She heard the breath of the wind, the even rhythm of hooves in dirt, and the quiet thrum of a heart that had once been too broken to beat alongside another's. Afterward, a girl with tear-streaked cheeks approached. "My brother came back from war, and he's not the same," she said. "But watching you too, I don't know. It gives me hope." Mabel nodded, eyes glistening. "That's all it takes. Just a little." That night, back at the ranch, Mabel removed the saddle and brushed Reaper beneath the stars. She leaned her forehead against his, her voice barely more than a breath. "You brought me back, too." And in the hush between stars and soil, neither of them felt alone. "You said." In the weeks following the county fair, Mabel noticed something subtle but steady shift in Reaper. He remained gentle, compliant, but there was a restlessness in his gait, a flicker in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't fear. It was energy, coiled and waiting, like he knew there was still more of himself to reclaim. Mabel recognized the feeling. She felt it too, an unnamed itch under the skin, as though both of them had come through the worst, but weren't yet sure what came next. One cool morning, Mabel found him at the far edge of the pasture, staring beyond the fence line. His ears pricked toward the rising hills, nostrils flaring as if he caught a scent from another world. She stood beside him, hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You want more room to run, don't you?" He didn't answer, of course, but his body did. A tension in the muscles, a shifting of weight, barely perceptible. Mabel had always kept him close, not to contain him, but to protect what they'd built. Yet now she saw it. Keeping him fenced was no longer kindness, it was limitation. And if she had truly earned his trust, then maybe it was time to trust him too. That night, she sat with Elias on the porch, her boots untied and legs stretched out across the boards. "He's ready," she said. Elias sipped his tea. "Ready for what?" "To remember what it feels like to be wild, but not lost." Elias looked at her, truly looked, and nodded. "You sure you are?" The question lingered. She wasn't, but she would be. The next morning, they trailered Reaper into the mountains, past the brushland and into a vast stretch of BLM rangeland, where wild herds were sometimes spotted. The air smelled of pine and sage. The wind curled around the truck in quiet spirals. When they reached the clearing, Mabel opened the gate. Reaper hesitated, then stepped down. He stood still, taking it all in. Sky stretching like a sail, distant hills bristling with juniper. The silence of real freedom. Mabel stepped beside him, holding the rope loosely. "I won't push you, but I won't hold you either." Reaper turned his head to her, eyes wide and liquid. She unfastened the halter slowly. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but the weight of letting go. The rope dropped to the dirt. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, with one powerful motion, Reaper bolted forward, not in panic, not in flight, but with grace, a clean arc of muscle and motion, his mane whipped behind him like a banner. He didn't look back. Mabel watched, her throat tight. It was not sadness she felt, but awe. He was not hers. He never had been. They had simply crossed paths long enough to heal something in each other. Elias stood a few feet behind her, arms folded. "Think he'll come back?" She wiped at her face with her sleeve. "I don't know. That's not the point." They camped nearby that night. The fire crackled low, and coyotes called in the distance. Mabel sat wrapped in a wool blanket, staring into the embers. "I spent so long thinking I had nothing left to give," she said. "But that horse, he gave me a second life, just by needing one." Elias poked at the fire. "Funny thing, people think strength is about holding on, but sometimes it's letting go and trusting what you built will last." She nodded, silent in agreement. The days that followed felt emptier. The ranch was quiet, too quiet. Mabel kept herself busy, mending harnesses, clearing the barn loft, oiling tools that hadn't been used in years. But every rustle in the trees made her pause. Every gust of wind had her glancing toward the pasture gate. She didn't expect him to return, but hope is a stubborn thing. Then, on a gray morning swollen with the promise of rain, she heard the soft thunder of hooves beyond the fence. She stepped onto the porch and saw him, Reaper, his coat muddy, his flanks streaked with dust. Behind him, a smaller mare with a crooked blaze on her forehead, and a foal barely old enough to stand steady. They followed him as if they'd always belonged there. Reaper halted at the fence, his head lifted high, proud, but his eyes found hers and held them. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. She opened the gate. He walked through like he'd never left. The mare followed, cautious but curious. The foal trotted between them, gangly and bright-eyed. Elias arrived minutes later, called by no more than instinct. He brought company. Mabel's voice shook with laughter. "Looks like he's paying it forward." The foal sniffed her hand. Mabel crouched, brushing a thumb along its soft muzzle. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Reaper stepped closer. She could feel the heat of him, the steady thrum of breath. Elias rested a hand on her shoulder. "Now we build something new." Mabel gazed at the 3 horses before her, one wild, one watchful, one just beginning. She had feared that letting go meant losing. But Reaper had returned not as a possession, but as a partner. And he had brought with him the very thing she hadn't dared to dream of, a future. That night, as the rain came gentle and steady, Mabel sat by the window. She watched Reaper stand in the pasture, flanked by the mare and the foal, still as a sentinel. She whispered into the night, not knowing if anyone or anything listened. "Thank you." Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the pasture in a silver wash. For a moment, the scene looked like a painting, timeless, rooted, whole. Mabel leaned back, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but peaceful. The storm passed. The pasture held. And for the first time in a long time, so did she. The arena buzzed with anticipation as Ruth guided Tempest through the gates. She didn't need the loudspeaker to announce her entry. Every head turned, murmurs rising like a tide through the crowd. A few gasps were audible. Some whispered her name in disbelief. Others simply stared, trying to piece together what an elderly woman was doing atop the horse nobody else could ride. Tempest, gleaming in the sunlight, didn't buck or rear. He trotted with power, his neck arched and eyes alert, but calm. Ruth sat tall, her frail hands firm on the reins, her back straighter than it had been in years. She wore no showy costume, no polished boots or spurs, just her old ranch coat and a faded pair of denim jeans, dusted at the cuffs with the sand of the arena. Silence spread as she came to a slow halt in the center of the ring. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ruth dropped the reins. Gasps rang out again. Tempest didn't move. She raised one hand and gave a subtle whistle, soft, barely audible. Tempest responded instantly, backing up 2 careful steps, then pivoting to the left. Another whistle. He spun the other way. The crowd was still. Hypnotized. She wasn't just riding him. She was communicating. Flashbacks burned through her mind. The weeks in that quiet pasture, the silent trust built over broken mornings, the stormy nights when she slept outside the stable just to calm him, the hours spent speaking to him not in commands, but in stories and memories and songs. This wasn't obedience. This was a bond carved in pain and healed through patience. Ruth tapped her heel gently. Tempest picked up a smooth canter, circling the arena in perfect rhythm. His hooves kissed the ground like music, and the crowd watched in stunned awe. The announcer, who had once mocked her presence, said nothing now. Backstage, Gideon, the former owner, stared with his mouth slightly agape. He had wagered that Tempest would remain untamable, that no one, especially not an old woman, could do what even seasoned trainers had failed to achieve. But now he saw something beyond his comprehension. Control without force, grace without dominance. Ruth drew Tempest to a halt once more. This time, she dismounted slowly and stood beside him. She looked out at the crowd, many still frozen in disbelief. With a small, polite nod, she led Tempest by the reins and began walking toward the exit gate. But as they passed Gideon, she stopped. He was leaning against the railing, his eyes locked on the horse. "I didn't break him," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "I listened." He blinked. "You've got no idea what that horse did to people. He's dangerous." "So are we all," Ruth replied, "when we've been hurt." Gideon looked away, as if stung. "You planning to keep him?" "I already have." Their eyes met briefly. For the first time, he didn't sneer or scoff. There was something else there. Not respect, perhaps, but a curious acknowledgement, like he was seeing a story he'd misread. Back at the barn, the tension finally faded from Ruth's shoulders. She patted Tempest's neck, whispering praise into his twitching ear. The horse huffed softly, nudging her side. A group of children who had watched the performance gathered at the fence. One of them, a red-haired girl, pressed her face through the bars. "Ma'am," she said shyly, "is he magic?" Ruth smiled. "No, sweetheart. He's just like you and me." "But how did you teach him that?" I didn't, Ruth said, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. I showed him he was safe. The rest was up to him. The children looked at each other, unsure whether they understood, but the awe remained. Later that afternoon, as the auction neared its end, the organizer approached her with a camera crew. Miss Ruth, folks are calling this the miracle of the season. Would you care to say a few words for the papers? She hesitated. Her bones ached, her throat dry, but she nodded. Facing the camera, she took a breath and spoke plainly. People think age is something that limits you, that you should step aside, fade out. But sometimes, all that means is you've had more time to learn what matters. I didn't come here to prove anything. I came to find something, and I did. She looked toward the stall where Tempest stood, head poking out, watching her with ears forward. He was called Untamable, wild, dangerous. But maybe the real danger, she said, turning back to the camera, is when we stop believing we can reach each other. The reporter was silent. Then he lowered the mic and nodded. That night, Ruth sat beneath the stars outside the small barn she had rented near the auction grounds. Tempest stood beside her, unhaltered, grazing quietly. She sipped from a chipped mug of tea and looked at him, his black coat, silvered by moonlight. I don't know what tomorrow brings, she whispered, her voice raspier than usual. But I know this much, you're free now. And so am I. Tempest lifted his head, his eyes catching the starlight, and took one step closer. He lowered his head gently against her shoulder. She didn't move, didn't speak. In that silent moment, with the night wind rustling the dry grass and the world holding its breath, the old woman and the once untamable horse stood together, still, whole, and unafraid. Mabel woke before dawn, the sky a soft violet behind the hills. The pasture lay quiet, mist curling between fence posts like pale ghosts. She dressed carefully in her old coat and sturdy boots, then walked barefoot to the barn, carrying a bucket of feed. At the gate, she paused, listening. The world held its breath. Reaper stood by the trough, his black coat dulled by morning dew. The mare and foal huddled close, watching her approach. She set the bucket down and spoke in a voice so low it might have been the wind. Good morning, she said. Her breath steamed in the chill. Ready for the next step? Reaper lifted his head, nostrils flaring. The foal whinnied softly, nipping at the mare's mane. Mabel brushed her palm along the fence, then reached through and scratched Reaper's forehead. He didn't shy away. Instead, he leaned in, pressing his muzzle into her hand. The mare stepped forward too, and the foal followed, an awkward dance of confidence and fear. Behind her, Elias emerged from the barn shadow. He carried the saddle, simple leather, broken in, with no fancy trappings. He set it on a hay bale. Neither spoke. They shared a look that said, I've got your back. Mabel straightened and faced the horses. Today, she whispered, we see how far we've come. She glanced at the foal, who pawed at the ground. He mirrored Reaper's earlier anxiety. Mabel knew fear was a teacher. She knelt, lifted a handful of oats, and offered it to the young colt. His ears flicked. After a moment, he sniffed and tasted. Mabel smiled, meeting his eyes. He ate the handful, then turned to his mother as if to say, It's okay. Mabel stood and lifted the saddle blanket. She draped it across Reaper's broad back. He rocked beneath it, but did not bolt. She laid the saddle gently in place. Reaper shifted, muscles tensing. Then he exhaled a long, steady breath. Mabel's heart pounded. This was the moment when two wounded souls tested the bond they'd built. She gripped the pommel and swung one leg over. Her body jolted, then settled. She sat in silent triumph, but she did not urge him forward. Instead, she waited, offering reassurance in the silence. The sun crept higher, light slanting onto the three horses. The world felt suspended. Minutes passed. Reaper stood motionless, as steady as a lighthouse. The mare stamped her hoof, impatient, and the foal bucked, full of mischief. Elias stepped closer and called, Want me to hold him? Mabel shook her head. He doesn't need holding. He needs believing. She patted Reaper's mane. Finally, she turned gently in the saddle. Reaper responded, pivoting on his heel with perfect balance. The mare followed, the foal trailing. Mabel urged him forward with a slight squeeze of her legs. He moved, first one step, then another, and broke into a walk around the corral. The mare and foal mirrored him, forming a ragged procession of newfound trust. Mabel closed her eyes and let the world tilt. Each hoofbeat was a promise kept. The mare nuzzled Reaper's flank, and he nudged her back. The foal tried to follow Reaper's gait, stumbling, then recovering. Mabel reached down to rub the foal's neck, then lifted her face to the sky and laughed, a sound equal parts relief and joy. Later, when the horses grazed contentedly beneath the cottonwood, Mabel dismounted. She stood beside Reaper, hand on saddle, and looked at Elias. "What now?" she asked softly. He thought for a moment. His gaze traveled across the pasture, to the hills beyond. "Now," he said, "we let them be free together. No fences needed." Mabel frowned lightly. "You'd let them roam?" He nodded. "They belong to the land as much as you do." Mabel studied Reaper's calm profile, the mare's gentle eyes, the foal's playful prance. She felt the weight of chains lifting, not just the rope or fence, but the invisible restraints she'd placed on herself. She'd tamed him, yes, but she'd also been tamed by fear. Now both were free. She looked at Elias with sudden clarity. "Will you help me fix the fences, move gates, open the pastures?" He smiled. "Already on it." Over the next hour, they worked together, unfastening fence latches, widening gateways, clearing brush. Reaper and his family followed at a respectful distance, curious but unthreatening. As the final latch swung open onto the rolling hills, Mabel paused, hand on the gate post, and breathed deeply. Light spilled over the landscape, illuminating tall grass, swaying like a sea. The wind carried the scent of sage and pine. Mabel felt tears pooling, not of sorrow, but of completion. "Go on," she whispered. "Live." Reaper flicked his tail, then clattered forward, hooves echoing off the earth. The mare and foal moved beside him. They crossed the threshold into the valley beyond, bodies strong, hearts unburdened. Mabel watched until they became silhouettes on the horizon, three shapes moving as one. When the last shape vanished into the grasses, she turned from the open gate. The world behind her felt different, wider, stranger, but full of promise. She strode back toward the barn, each step lighter than the last. Elias joined her, carrying the empty saddle. They walked side by side in comfortable silence, the gate swinging closed behind them. When they reached the barn, Mabel stood in its doorway and looked back out at the hills. She saw no fences, no lines, just endless possibility. Elias cleared his throat. "Think they'll come back?" Mabel smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Maybe, or maybe not. But isn't that the point?" He nodded. "It is." She turned fully toward him, shoulders squared, spirit renewed. "We did what we came to do." He grinned. "That we did." Together, they stepped into the barn's cool shadow, leaving the wide-open world behind them for now. Outside, the wind sang across the meadow, a song of freedom and second chances. Mabel closed her eyes and let it wash over her, the echo of hoofbeats, fading but never forgotten. And in that moment, she knew that sometimes the greatest victories weren't trophies or applause. They were the quiet ones, one in partnership with something wild, when you dared to trust beyond your own fears.